Hello and welcome to Obscure History. In this video, we'll be covering the Indo-Greek kingdom, which ruled over parts of modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India between 186 BC and 10 AD. To start, I'd like to point out that our surviving written evidence around this topic is quite minimal compared to many other subjects relating to antiquity. Our Western sources are fairly insufficient, and this is mostly due to geography and other important events taking place a lot closer to home, such as the rise of Rome to the status of empire through their many wars which take place during this time period. But what we can piece together makes for an interesting tale to tell. So with that said, let's discuss the kingdom of the Indo-Greeks. So who are the Indo-Greeks? Like many other consequences resulting in the Hellenistic era, we can trace the foundation of this kingdom to Alexander the Great. After his Bactrian campaign, which took him 2 years to somewhat pacify, he left a considerable contingent of Greek mercenaries in the area. Before then, the Achaemenid Persian Empire practiced the movement of whole populations, and they did this with the Greeks. So even before Alexander arrived on the scene, there would have been a substantial ethnic Greek minority in what would become Afghanistan and of the Punjab region, back then known as Gandhara, after his excursion into northwest India. Following the great conqueror's death, the region would fall under Seleucid control, but would then quickly declare its own independence, forming what we call the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This fascinating Hellenistic kingdom deserves its own video, but for the purposes of discussing the Indo-Greeks, it is impossible to continue without first establishing this context. In 186 BC, the ruler of Greco-Bactria at the time was Demetrius I Anicetus, and like many rulers of that era, he wanted to imitate Alexander. This, naturally, meant looking for some place to go and conquer. At the same time, the Mauryan Empire based in India proper was in political and military turmoil. Taking advantage of the unrest, Demetrius set out with his army from Bactria, crossing the Hindu Kush mountain range, and quickly overran most of northwest India. This included taking back all the regions that were lost under Seleucus I Nicator to the Mauryans around 100 years earlier. Besides the prestige that came with conquest, Demetrius' strike into India would also have other reasons behind it. As we have already discussed, there would have been a considerable amount of Greeks living in Gandhara already, so it would have made sense for Demetrius to move in to protect any colonists in the region. The main successor state of the Mauryans, known as the Shunga, had no tolerance for the Buddhist faith, and sources from Gandhara at this time mention the explicit persecution of the faith by the Shunga. As many Greek colonists would have been living in settlements where Buddhism was commonly practiced, it makes sense to assume that not even the Greeks were safe from this danger. Even worse for Demetrius, whilst consolidating his newly won territories, news quickly reached the king that Bactria, back across the mountains, was being contested by a usurper named Eucratides. This meant the Greco-Bactrian kingdom effectively split into two, as loyalty soon became split between Demetrius and his dynasty and the usurper, causing the official split of the Indo-Greek kingdom from Bactria with its power base in Gandhara. We can then assume that Demetrius spent the next 6 years or so trying to re-establish control over Bactria, whilst also fighting off incursions from the Shunga. Demetrius must have died at around 180 BC of unknown causes. This is the current consensus, as it allows for the later numismatic evidence of later Indo-Greek kings to make sense in the timeline. Demetrius is considered the first king of the Indo-Greeks, and his descendants would continue to rule over parts of India long after him. At present, 37 individual rulers have been identified through numismatic evidence alone. If it was not for this numismatic evidence, we would never have known of their existence due to how scarce surviving sources are. Historians have been able to use the coins discovered to create a rough timeline for each ruler, and where they have been found it's very telling, as it's provided a good measurement of territorial boundaries for each individual. For example, we know that Demetrius more than likely ruled from the city of Taxila due to the volume of his coins found on that site. We will look into the coinage of the Indo-Greeks in more detail in a minute, but first I'd like to talk about the cultural blending between East and West. It's clear that the native peoples of northwest India and the Greeks had been exchanging ideas in culture, art and religion for a fair while at this point. But the second invasion of 186 BC certainly accelerated this process. The Greeks seemed to have a positive disposition to Buddhism, which had a widespread practice in the region. They would in fact use some of the best aspects of their culture and art to improve upon the Buddhist faith rather than supplant it outright, and create what we now call Greco-Buddhism. We even have Indian records of Greeks making Buddhist pilgrimages and converting outright. This is not to say the Greeks totally lost their own identity, as they in fact did a good job at preserving large aspects of this, given their remoteness from the largely Greek-based Mediterranean. The mixture of culture and religious practices is best exemplified through the many incredible works of art that have survived to the present day. Before the Greeks ever arrived on the scene, we know that the followers of Buddhism would make use of symbols and writing to depict the Buddha, but being the very visual people they are, the Greeks wanted to put their own stamp on the figure by creating the first physical representations of the Buddha in human form. The image on screen shows one of the earliest known examples of Greco-Buddhist art. The Buddha, wearing the Greek chiton, sits cross-legged and is flanked by another familiar figure. In Buddhist lore, the protector of the Buddha is Vajrapani, a type of wrath deity. The associations of Vajrapani lined up neatly with the Greek demigod Heracles, who is after all considered a protector of all Greeks. The decision behind substituting Vajrapani for Heracles seems to be one born of familiarity, whilst bridging the gap between the two cultures. This should not be too surprising, as we have many other records of other Hellenistic states incorporating the Greek pantheon with those deities worshipped by the native peoples they lorded over. One of the better known examples of this is in Ptolemaic Egypt with the creation of Zeus Ammon. We also start to see images of the Buddha being incorporated into the very buildings themselves, such as this Corinthian-style column with the figure of the Buddha in the center as depicted here. These Indo-Greek columns have been found all across the Gandhara region. It's also fascinating seeing such a classic piece of artwork with a unique spin to it. Here we have one of the surviving frescoes depicting an important scene in Greek mythos. This example being the famous siege of Troy, complete with the Trojan horse in an Eastern style. When looking back at the numismatic evidence, we can see that the coins produced are clearly of Greek design from the reign of Demetrius, but we start to see a shift towards more bilingual coins with symbols and messages written on them. The sheer amount of coins found strongly suggests extensive mining operations, which were more than likely based around the Hindu Kush. We can also discern that they must have had some level of trade with the Chinese Han Empire. The directness of this trade is admittedly uncertain, but Chinese records do state that Han merchants did travel frequently to Bactria, and therefore by extension the Gandhara region where the Indo-Greeks were based. It is known that the Han had created a metal alloy by mixing copper and nickel together, which they used to create coins. Inventively known as cupro-nickel, this alloy soon found its way in the hands of the Indo-Greeks, as coins made from this material start to appear during the reigns of Pantaleon and Agathocles around 170 BC throughout Gandhara. The image on screen shows one of these examples minted under Agathocles, with a bust of Dionysus on the left and a panther on the right, with some vine leaves. As a fun side fact, it seems the worship of Dionysus was rather common in the Indo-Greek kingdom, which makes a lot of sense when you know that in the mythos, Dionysos had travelled to the continent of India. As the Han were the only known producers of this alloy, it stands to reason that the level of trade must have been consistent enough for the metal to make its way to the North India region via the Silk Road, a network of loosely connected corridors that at the time stretched from Anatolia in the west to Han China in the east. When we look at all the Hellenistic kings who ruled in India, it's safe to say that outside of Demetrius I, none enjoyed more success than Menander I Soteros, the Saviour, who ruled between 155 and 130 BC. During his rule, it's clear the Indo-Greek realm was at its highest prosperity in almost all walks of life. After all, his coins are the most prevalent of all the Indo-Greek kings. The largest known coin hoards have been found at Sagala, known to the Greeks as Euthydemia, where it's assumed he moved the capital of the kingdom. Sagala greatly prospered from the silk trade, and it must have been a sight to behold, with both Greek and Indian designs influencing the city's look. About 100 years after his time, the Greek historian Strabo had nothing but praise for Menander, even going as far as to claim that he, quote, conquered more tribes than Alexander the Great. This quote by Strabo is further backed by Indian accounts which describe Indo-Greek incursions into Mathura, Panchala, Saketa, and possibly as far as Pataliputra, the capital city of the Shunga Empire. We also know of an attempted invasion by their Greco-Bactrian cousins into Gandhara, where Menander handily managed to repel the usurper Eucratides, thus consolidating the rule of the Indo-Greeks in India. Much of what we know about Menander comes from a series of Buddhist texts known as the Milinda Panda, or the Questions of Menander, Milinda being the Indian form of the name. According to the tradition, Menander conversed with a Buddhist sage named Nagasena at court, which resulted in his full conversion to the faith. The following is a quote translated by T.W. Rice Davids from the Milinda Panda, which introduced Menander as follows. Quote, King of the city of Euthydemia in India, Milinda by name, learned, eloquent, wise, and able, and a faithful observer, and that at the right time of all the various acts of devotion and ceremony enjoined by his own sacred hymns concerning things past, present, and to come. Many were the arts and sciences that he knew. As a disputant, he was hard to equal, harder still to overcome, the acknowledged superior of all the founders of the various schools of thought, and as in wisdom, so in strength of body, swiftness, and valour, there was found none equal to Milinda in all India. He was rich too, mighty in wealth and prosperity, and the equal of his armed hosts knew no end. End quote. This is by no means an isolated incident, as many of the Hellenistic monarchs wanted to ingratiate themselves with the local populations they ruled over. The Ptolemies of Egypt spring to mind again, as they portrayed themselves as the pharaohs of old. It seems that Menander was merely following a standard practice which other Hellenistic monarchs also undertook. His conversion is further attested to by another Greek historian, Plutarch, giving us multiple accounts to back up the fact that this indeed took place. After his conversion, the Milinda Panda goes on to state that Menander voluntarily abdicated the kingship to his son, Strato I, instead wanting to live the ascetic lifestyle, where he went on to obtain nirvana, the ultimate enlightenment in Buddhist tradition. However, other evidence, such as those written again by Plutarch, points to his sudden death whilst fighting on another campaign. Menander is mostly known nowadays for his conversion, but his biggest achievement is arguably the successful bridging between the two cultures. By the time of Menander's death, his kingdom had already started to fracture between various rival claimants. As mentioned previously, we only know of most of these rulers via their coins. By 10 AD, the last two of these kings, both named Strato, were more or less ruling from Sagala and the surrounding countryside when they were invaded by the nomadic Yuezhi people, who were forced to migrate due to clashes with Han China and other nomadic groups. Before reaching Gandhara, they had wiped out Greek rule completely in Bactria around 120 BC, and they continued through to northwest India. After 10 AD, there are no further mentions of any Greeks ruling in their own right in this corner of the world, but the Greek identity as a whole would continue to endure for centuries afterwards. The invading Yuezhi would end up settling and would eventually form the Kushan Empire, adopting the Greek alphabet as their administrative language and making use of Greek iconography. There are plenty of coins produced which display all of this, but that goes out of scope for what we have been discussing. It is worth wondering, however, had the Indo-Greeks been more unified politically, would they have been better prepared for these nomadic invasions? This would surely make for some interesting alternate history, but alas, the Indo-Greeks couldn't unify enough to defend their independence in the end. Here is where we will end our adventure into the Hellenistic Indo-Greek kingdom. If you have made it to the end of the video, I would like to thank you for listening in and sticking around. This type of content is very different to produce compared to the usual short videos I would normally create, and I've enjoyed every moment in crafting it. I find it fitting that I should make my first longer form video based on the mysterious civilization that were the Indo-Greeks. I would highly recommend searching further into the topic, as there are plenty other works of Greco-Buddhist artistry available to view, not to mention the magnitude of interesting characters that were not covered during this video. If you have found anything that has been discussed in this video to be of interest, why not consider liking and commenting, as my goal is to ultimately produce more content like this, and it will help the channel to hopefully grow. Until next time, this has been Obscure History.